Hi everyone. I hope you're staying warm. I'm gonna run through a quick PowerPoint that I put together. I don't know how quick it is. I haven't tested it out yet, but hopefully it won't take up too much of your time. Um, Basically, just sort of walking you through a review of the content of the first volume of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but then also attempting to connect it up with different formalist, critical and theoretical frameworks that you've been introduced to this semester. So why don't we get started doing that? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I was really worried for a second I had a typo right on the title slide. Although no promises that there won't be typos going forward here. So let's just get to it. As you'll remember, if you've read through the first novel, uh, uh, read through the first volume of the novel. The first volume begins with four letters addressed to someone named Mrs. Seville, who we find out is the sister of the letter writer Robert Walton, an Englishman who's attempting an expedition to the North Pole. But then in the fourth letter, which is dated almost a year after the first one, the novel sort of transitions from the form of letters to a kind of diary or journal that relates to the sighting of a being of gigantic stature. You can probably guess who that's going to be, traveling across ice on a dog sled, as well as the rescue of a European who, it turns out, had been in pursuit of the daemon, or the daemon is what Victor Frankenstein, as we come to find out, what Victor Frankenstein calls this creature who, this being that the ship had seen while they were sort of trapped uh, among a bunch of plates of ice. Anyway, after only two more dated entries then in this journal, Walton begins to record through the voice of Victor Frankenstein a tale that Victor relates to him, hoping that it will afford Robert a view of nature which may enlarge his faculties and understanding. And all the quotations there are taken from the novel. Thereafter, the rest of volume one is broken into seven chapters. And so, just to rush and sprint through the contents, chapter one introduces us to Victor Frankenstein's family, his father, his mother, and also introduces us to his early education. We also learn about Elizabeth and Henry Clerval, and as well as a bit about his brothers. In chapter two, tragedy strikes. Victor's mother dies from an illness she contracted from taking care of Elizabeth. And then shortly after that death, he departs for university, which he was supposed to do before his mother fell ill. Chapter three details his university education, which corrects some early learning, where he was reading sort of alchemists and various other pseudoscientists, and so he learns all about modern chemistry, and searches for life's origins, and even hatches a plan to try to create a human being on his own. Chapter four, he successfully animates the creature as we traditionally refer to the monster in the novel. And then, sort of serendipitously, his friend Henry arrives at his university town, and Victor falls ill. And of course, there's a whole lot more here. Victor runs away from the creature, and then when he sees Henry and they get back to his apartment or laboratory, the creature is gone. So. Anyway, chapter five opens with a letter from Elizabeth. But then after that letter closes, we get some background about William and also a new character named Justine. Victor goes around introducing Henry to his various professors, and of course suffering all the while because they're praising him, but of course he has the weight of what he's done on his mind. Chapter six, we get a letter from Alphonse, who is Victor's father. We learn of William's death, and Victor sort of is shown out of the university town by Henry, but then has a slow return home. He sights the creature when he's out, sort of among and watching storms coming across mountains, and he sees the creature ambling quite quickly up the mountains. When he finally does make it home, he learns of the accusations against Justine, who we've just learned about in the previous chapter, that she's being accused of murdering young William. And then, of course, chapter seven includes the Justine's trial as well as her coerced confession. And then that's it. So that's the plot. That's what we learned know so far about the content of the novel. And of course, by Thursday, you're supposed to read a few chapters. I think 5 chapters um, into volume two. So, but how would a critic read Frankenstein? So what I've just done is what anybody reading the novel would sort of pick up on, but what would a critic sort of note, or how would they begin to approach a study of the novel? Like anything related to study or to writing, it really depends. As you'll recall, we've studied at least three 20th century formalisms this semester, spending most of our time with new criticism. That's Cleanth Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn. But we've also touched on structuralism, or I've sometimes called poetics, what Jonathan Culler sometimes calls structuralist poetics, putting the words together. And then we've just dipped our toes in something called post-structuralism, and a particular variant of that called deconstruction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how critics sort of occupying or positioning themselves with respect to these different frameworks might begin a study of the novel. You'll recall that for new criticism, new critics, new criticism, new critical formalism works according to a general principle that good literature is unified and organic. So Cleanth Brooks might not claim that the language of prose fiction is the language of paradox, the way he claims that the language of poetry is. But in his textbook, Understanding Fiction, which he co-wrote with Robert Penn Warren, they do claim that discussion of plot often brings us back to theme, just as discussing motivation leads to the question of character, and that this is only natural, for a good story is, after all, a unity. Discussing one element of it is going to eventually loop you around to talking about another element. It is consistent with itself. The world of imagination that it presents is coherent, and he italicizes coherent. Later, Brooks and Warren write, quote, the meaning, the theme of a story, of a good story, is general and pervasive. It's not just to be found in sort of a general statement that we find somewhere in the story. Uh, um, I am now realizing there's a typo in that last sentence, so apologies, but I think the basic sense there is that a story shows organic unity, all parts contribute to the meaning. So that for a good story, all parts of it contribute to the meaning. And in this sense, literary stories will operate in similar ways to literary poetry, although poetry is more condensed and saturated with, say, paradoxes and irony than, say, stories necessarily are. But that point of unity, organic coherence, that every part of it relates to each other in order to sort of build and qualify that message, we see that the same general principle it holds with respect to how Brooks approaches fiction. So the problem for a new critical approach to Frankenstein, or one, might be to account for how a theme in the novel is uniquely developed by the novel's characters and plot, or how the plot is uniquely modified by characterization and thematic development, or hopefully you're seeing a pattern here, how characterization is uniquely expressed through or pressured by plot and informed by theme. Note I said characterization with no problem on this slide. So anyway, to begin tackling this kind of problem in a reading of Frankenstein, we would have to just begin somewhere. So choosing a theme or choosing a character or choosing a plot point and sort of seeing where that takes us, beginning to gather and track patterns and connections among these things and thinking about how they work together. So note, we cannot be as comprehensive in a reading of a novel as we can be with a lyric poem, because it's much bigger than a lyric poem. So we must be guided by our interests and trust our critical training and instincts. What interested you most? Start there. So, for example, one thing I noticed in this sort of read through of Frankenstein is how repeatedly the novel refers to friendship and companionship as a desired good or a desired aim. So for instance, you have Robert Walton's desire that he expresses to his sister for a man who could sympathize with him. Almost on cue, Victor Frankenstein shows up, but then sort of doesn't quite doesn't quite satisfy that desire, and talks about, woe is me, and I've had friends before, and but he does claim to be entitled to judge respecting friendship because he had really close friends before going on this excursion. in pursuit of the creature. We learn details, random details of Victor's father's intimate friendships, and this is in fact how he met his wife, Caroline, and even why Victor knows Henry is because his father is intimate friends with Henry's father. Um, or at least I should have double checked that, but I think I'm right about that. And of course, the description of Victor's relationships with Elizabeth, with Henry, and even with the kinder of the two professors he works with, friendship works its way into the description of these as well. Um, and then there's also, in terms of the sort of ethics or moral aspect of the novel, the judgment of Victor's friends or the self-judgment of Victor when he thinks about how he's sort of locking himself or secluding himself from his family while he's sort of, digging up body parts and stitching them together and animating the creature. He notes as early as, page 38 or wherever this comes from in this edition, that he knows his silence is disquieting his family and his friends, that they're worried about him. Um, and of course, another pattern throughout is the pangs and the damage that can result from isolation and loneliness. And this is, of course, for those who've read the novel, you know that this is going to sort of amplify once some another character in the novel begins to tell their story. So any the repetition of this, of references to friendship, companionship, isolation, loneliness, and even the moral dynamic of staying in touch with people you care about, suggests that these references are not just incidental or accidental, but rather sort of central to the purpose of the narrative. And so if I was pursuing a new critical reading of the novel, I might sort of push this as I can go and sort of show how this sort of like thread of friendship or companionship um, is part of the unity, is a sort of unifying force in the novel that sort of helps it hang together. It helps the plot sort of structure itself. The plot itself is organized around, right, relationships like that. That the very motivations that characters pursue or don't pursue in a sort of mirror or foil-like fashion are sort of engineered around friendship. There is still a remaining question, though, and that is what about friendship? I would have to develop that argument. What sort of outlook or perspective does the novel uniquely give with respect to friendship and its relationship to these other things? So that's what a new critical reading might do. As far as structuralist poetics, you may sort of recall that the general principle is to account for the codes and conventions that make it possible to make sense of Frankenstein as a text generally, and as a narrative more specifically, or even as an example of horror or romanticist fiction even more specifically, right? Here's a passage from Color, where he identifies what he calls the most basic convention that governs the novel as a genre. The basic convention which governs the novel is our expectation that the novel will produce a world. So whether it's Frankenstein or whether it's Harry Potter, whatever it is, we expect to be introduced to a world or to watch a world be produced by the work. Words must be composed in such a way that through the activity of reading, there will emerge a model of the social world, models of the individual personality, of the relations between the individual and society, and perhaps most important, of the kind of significance which these aspects of the world bear. So one poetic approach to Frankenstein, or one poetics approach to Frankenstein, might be to ask what we could contribute to a theory of the novel, the genre of the novel, through a study of Frankenstein's presentation of a world. N.H. Stevens, the writer of our textbook, points out, quote, one of the first things that reader often notice about the text, and she's talking about Frankenstein, is its unusual mode of narration or way of telling the story, end quote. A new critic might try to connect Shelley's mode of narration to the novel's unique organic unity, but a poetics approach moves in the opposite direction, describing as accurately as possible what Shelley contributes to a theory of the novel as world presentation and what this kind of odd um, what this odd mode of narration contributes to our theory of the novel. Of course, we might have a different theory. We could work with different theories of the novel. Maybe we don't think that the most basic convention of a novel is the production of a world. We have another idea. But regardless of our theory, a poetics approach could ask how Shelley's work might contribute to that theory or to our understanding of the capital letter, the novel, capital N novel. So how would you start to do this? Well, Stevens, if you look at the near the back of the textbook, charts the difference between the novel's chronology from Alphonse's life and his career, which he gives up to start a family, as described at the beginning of chapter one, to the final chronological action, which does coincide with the very end of the novel. So the difference between its chronology and its plot. So while the chronology would begin with Alphonse's early life and early career, the novel's plot begins with Robert Walton's first letter to his sister, right? And so the novel ends, the novel's plot and its chronology end at the same point, at the very end of the novel. Anyway, the comparison between its chronology or its action and its plot brings us insight into Shelley's nonlinear orchestration of events and the nested narratives and documents that make such an orchestration possible. So I've already described this. It begins with letters that turn into a journal that then feeds into a chaptered narrative. But then even in chapters 5 and 6 of that first volume, we have letters nested even in those chapters. What Shelley's novel shows us is that the use of letters as a framing device affords a great many possibilities for world presentation and narrative flexibility. There are also some constraints there that one would have to account for, but it also affords quite a lot. The Poetics of Frankenstein can teach us about framed narratives in general and how they afford effects like mystery, unreliability, the way in which narratives can fade in and out, how the sort of jump cuts between different sections open up all kinds of questions and problems. Um, that's what I'm calling here strategic gaps in detail, but also the way in which frames sort of set up or sort of highlight thematic echoes that sort of travel across those frames. And so, coming back to the idea of friendship, right? That the way Robert Walton's concern about friendship sort of anticipates how friendship is going to sort of like continue to recur as we get deeper and deeper and deeper into the different frames and then sort of work our way back out. So, as a review, then, a new critic will attempt to evaluate and interpret the novel, demonstrate its unique communication of a theme or idea directly and indirectly through the interactivity of its elements. So Brooks also calls this sort of organic unity of plot, character, theme, and any other element or aspect of fiction you could think of. A structuralist would attempt to construct a theory of the novel or of narrative or of character or some other literary structure using Frankenstein as a resource or exemplary text, right? Or they might ask, what sort of theory of the novel would have to already be in place in order for the novel to be meaningful to us in the way that it's meaningful to us, right? So recall color then. Poetics starts with attested meanings or effects and asks how they are achieved. And then hermeneutics starts, that's interpretation, starts with texts and asks what they mean, seeking to discover new and better interpretations. All right, so here's the tricky one. Deconstruction, the trickiest, I should say. So the general principle of deconstruction, which of course is developed by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, is that no text is a full organic unity. So Cleanth Brooks's hope of accounting for the organic unity of a text, Derrida thinks that doesn't exist, right? Or we can try to account for it, but it's going to be an illusion, right? Because every text, in order to even be a text at all, has to be haunted by the traces of other meanings that always threaten to supplement or supplant the illusion of its unity, right? So for Jacques Derrida, a deconstructive approach would produce an account first of a text's effort to achieve clarity or unity. So he doesn't deny that texts don't try to or that authors don't try to, but it would also account for the traces we might think of as the system of traces that disrupt this effort and that challenge us to reconceptualize the novels or the text's fundamental ideas. In short, this critical reading that Derrida sort of models for us in his work is not an effort to destroy the text, even though deconstruction might look a little like destruction. It's not deconstruction. It's not an effort to destroy the text or to judge it as a failure, but rather to display as fully as possible what Derrida calls the play of self-differentiating meanings that the text enacts. Self-differentiating, meaning for Derrida, any text differs from itself, right? With every encounter with it, it's going to be a different text, right? It changes. Um, and it changes because of those little traces of other meanings that are already embedded in it. And so, just as a quick note, the French word trace, so the word translated from French into the English word trace, the French word is in fact trace, so trace. But in French, that word can mean mark, track, path, and might even invoke images of, say, footprints, right? And so we have this sense in English when we in crime dramas, for instance, detectives talk about trace evidence. So trace meaning sort of stuff that's left behind or different marks. Um, but it is important to sort of think about traces also as pathways, tracks that if you follow them actually lead you out of the text itself or lead the outside in so that stuff is always coming in from the outside to sort of alter our experience of a text. So here's the problem, though. We might ask what strategies at aesthetic or thematic unity do we see at work in the novel, right? But then we would follow that up by asking what presuppositions or binary oppositions support those strategies. Do we see other signifying forces at work? Any trace evidence of other meanings that haunt the novel's purported unity or moral purpose, right? We might consider, for instance, how paratextual elements of the novel extend its frame even beyond Robert Walton's letter to his sister. So we tend, when we summarize the novel, to think about the letters that open it as the sort of outer frame. And as we read into the novel, we sort of move into different frames and then work our way back out again to Robert Walton. However, you'll remember if you flip to the pages immediately preceding volume one, that there is a preface, and we could ask, is that preface part of the text? People think that the preface was probably written by Percy Shelley, Mary's husband, although it speaks in the voice of as if it was Mary. But also, what about the title page? The title page that also includes the subtitle, Modern Prometheus, that explicitly connects myth and modernity. And also, with its epigraph drawn from Paradise Lost, sort of weaves the novel into a biblical tradition, but not just a biblical tradition, but a modern interpretation of a biblical tradition. And what of the dedication page? Mary Shelley writes her father on there. Her father was a sort of um, radical progressive writer and thinker and political philosopher and literary writer. And so we can think about like what do we make of these parts of the novel? And are they part of the novel or are they not? Right? How do we demarcate what is inside and outside of the book? Right. Do they frame its meaning? The title page, the dedication page, the preface, do these frame the meaning of the novel, or is there some sort of war of significations or some sort of play of signification, sort of that we can sort of track there and sort of then follow into our reading of the book? The preface of the novel notes that the opinions that spring from the character and situation of the hero, Victor Frankenstein or Robert Walton, it's a little unclear who is being referred to there, are not to be confused with the author's own convictions, nor, the preface continues, is any inference justly to be drawn from the following pages as prejudicing any philosophical doctrine of whatever kind. So, in other words, the preface is sort of saying, don't read too far into things. Don't think that the author is intending some sort of moral or political message to be getting across here. And yet, the novel's subtitle, its epigraph, and its dedication offer a triplicate reference to rebellion against unjust authority. As the editor of this edition, Michael Beyroube, points out in his notes to the preface's comment, quote, might be an insincere disavowal of the novel's intellectual and political radicalism, end quote. And so if I was a deconstructivist, I might ask, what might we make of these paratextual frames and their warring traces inside the novel itself? So sort of deconstructing the binary opposition of inside and outside, or of preface and actual story, of supplement and main content, sort of deconstructing that, I might sort of ask that question. Indeed, already in Volume 1, we see plenty of restagings of situations and narratives deployed to convey philosophical or at least moral doctrine of some kind, and plenty of evidence to suggest that those stagings might already be compromised. Sort of a further comment on deconstructive reading, then, we might ask, what would be the purpose of building a deconstructive account of the signifying war between the novel's political radicalism and the preface's disavowal of moral, political, or philosophical messaging? As a novel, that is, in a way, about all about the sympathetic effects and purposive strategies of telling stories, Frankenstein's deconstruction might lead us toward a reconceptualization of what it might mean for a work of fiction to have a politics or to be political at all. What is the relation between aesthetics and politics? To what degree does political work of a text, of an activist, of a politician, rest paradoxically on disavowals of politics, the kind we see in the preface? Which might be another way of asking to what degree politics itself relies on an aesthetics that attempts to disavow its relationship to politics. So deconstructive reading toys with the text, toys with sort of slippages of meaning, toys with, the difference between sort of a stated purpose and then the way in which a text undermines that purpose. But it often tries to lead us toward reconceptualizing sort of bigger ideas along the way. In a concluding example, think of the final chapter, chapter 7, where we see Justine's trial. A new critic might ask, how does this chapter contribute to the novel's theme, to its characterization of Victor or Elizabeth, to the effects of its plotting? It would sort of ask questions about how it contributes to the organic unity of the novel, right? A structuralist, on the other hand, might ask, how does this chapter contribute to a theory of narrative reliability, to an account of the limits or affordances of framed or nested structures, to the role that minor characters play in the development of a world's presentation, right? To be asking questions about what we might contribute to our theory of the novel by looking closely at this chapter. Deconstructivists would ask all kinds of other questions. Do we see traces of the conflict between the preface and other paratexts here? By paratexts, I mean details of the book that are not necessarily part of the story, but that are kind of seem to be dressing it or ornamenting it, right? And what of traces of Walton's frame? What might Walton's sort of letters, his frame, contribute to our understanding of the link between Victor's animation of the creature, his animation of this tale for Walton, and his mediated orchestration of Justine's downfall? Is there a link between nested narratives and framing someone for murder? In other words, focusing on the word frame and framing, we might ask, is there something to deconstruct between the idea of a framed narrative at all, or narrative framing, nested narratives, and the way we use in English the word framing to talk about when someone is set up for murder or a crime, right? In the way that Justine seems to be, right? Since they found the picture of Caroline on her person. We don't yet know how it got there, although we will find out by the end of the novel. All right, I think that's all I got for you. Before I go, I just want to quickly, if you didn't know what I was talking about with respect to the paratexts, here's here's the Project Gutenberg edition of Frankenstein. This is right on the front here is a reproduction of the title page. You can kind of see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's the subtitle. Here's the explicit epigraph from Paradise Lost. Explicit just meaning it's cited Paradise Lost. It's not implicit. And then here, sort of in textual form, you sort of see this is the epigraph. Epigraph here. Here's the dedication to William Godwin. This is Mary Shelley's father. And then here's the preface. And this bit here is what I was quoting earlier in the PowerPoint. So, all right. So I think that's about it. And I look forward to seeing everybody later this week. So I'll see you on Thursday. Bye. Hope you stay warm.